A very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for finding time to be with us today. And I trust that your day is coming up well. A few minutes past 3 p.m. here in Nairobi, East African time. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuned in and watching us from. And this afternoon, different from what perhaps I've been doing in the recent time, to bringing us the latest news from across the continent of Africa. We're going to look at a topic of discussion, still a very developing story across the continent of Africa, and that is the recent events that has engulfed in Sudan. And we are trying to look at the different aspects of this conflict that has seen two generals being pitted against each other. So in the show this afternoon, I'd like to give us just a little bit of a background on what could have possibly started this conflict, and some of the things that have been happening that have culminated to what we saw there on Saturday. So the fighting that has erupted in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, and elsewhere in the country is a direct result of a vicious power struggle within the country's military leadership. I think we all know that right now the clashes are between the regular army and the paramilitary force called the Rapid Support Forces, otherwise known as the RSF. So in case you're wondering what is this country and where is it located, Sudan is in Northeast Africa and is one of the largest countries on the continent, covering about 1.9 million square kilometers. It is also one of the poorest countries in the world, with its 46 million people living on an average annual income of $750 a head. The population of Sudan is predominantly Muslim, and the country's official language are Arabic and English. Okay, so in case you're wondering who is fighting in Sudan, well, since the coup in 2021, Sudan has been run by a council of generals led by the two military men at the center of this dispute. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of the armed forces, and in effect the country's president, and his deputy and leader of the RSF, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti. That is his nickname. And why has the fighting started now? Now, the violence follows days of tension as members of the RSF were redeployed around the country last week in a move that the army saw as a threat. There had been some hope that talks could resolve the situation, but this never happened, and it is disputed who fired the first shot on Saturday morning. But fighting has since escalated in different parts of the country, with almost right now close to 200 civilians have died, according to a Sudanese doctors union. And the last we were watching on this developing story in Sudan, the fighting still continues, but I think also the RSF came out and made a statement saying that it was willing to have a truce and to have a cessation of hostilities, and is ready to have any kinds of talk, I guess, in a more structured way. That is what Dagalo said a few moments ago, and this is a developing story, so even much of that has a lot has developed since then. And so the civilians are caught up. Even though the conflict appears to be around control of key installations, much of it is happening in urban areas, and civilians have become the unwitting victims. It is not exactly clear why the RSF bases, where the RSF bases are, but it seems that their fighters have moved into densely populated areas. The Sudanese Air Force has mounted airstrikes in the capital, a city of more than 6 million people, which is likely to have led to civilian casualties. There was a brief pause in the fighting on Sunday, agreed by both sides to allow people to escape the fighting, and of course that cessation of hostilities agreement was quickly violated by both sides. So what are the Rapid Support Forces? I'm just trying to get us to just know just the basics of what is happening right now, just the key factors and the actors, and perhaps what is at stake here in Sudan. And that's why I've bothered to give us just a bit of a background information so that we're able to tie in all this together. There's a lot of information flying around, but it's important to understand the the basis and some of the history behind what is happening now. The RSF was formed in 2013 and has its origins in the notorious Janjaweed militia that brutally fought rebels in Darfur, where they were accused of ethnic cleansing. Since then, General Dagalo has built a powerful force that has intervened in conflicts in Yemen and Libya. I've told you numerous times over here that this Janjaweed now they call the RSF now. They transformed them, they changed their name. They have been used as mercenaries for hire in the conflict in Yemen and also in Libya. And the countries in the Middle East has played a huge role in even funding some of these activities and in these countries that they've been used in the conflicts that are ongoing. He has also developed economic interest. This is Dagalo. He has developed also economic interest, including controlling some of Sudan's gold mines. Okay? That is General Dagalo, the head of this RSF. Now, the RSF has been accused of human rights abuses, including the massacre of more than 120 protesters in June of 2019. Remember, after the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir in April, and then the continuation of the protesters and the protesting that led to a brutal attack on the protesters in June 2019, just 2 months after our former President Omar al-Bashir was ousted in power. And RSF is said to have been responsible for the killings of these protesters, that the figures place at 120 people. Such a strong force outside the army has always been seen as a source of instability in the country, and how Sudanese forces or as a country could not have seen this coming, I don't understand. So why is the military in charge of Sudan? Okay, so this fighting is the latest episode in bouts of tension that followed the ousting of long-serving President Omar al-Bashir in 2019. So that is how the military found itself in power. But even some would argue that even before the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir himself was leading the country in a very military way. So it was a very militarized country. So the military was very much involved in the day-to-day running and part of the leadership of Sudan, even during Omar al-Bashir's time, but it was not as outright as it is right now. So there were huge protests calling for an end to his near 3-decade rule, and the army mounted a coup that got rid of him, but civilians continue to campaign for a return to democratic rule. And General Dagalo has said that the 2021 coup, remember, that removed the Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok from the civilian side, he came out, I think, was it in February, to say that that was a mistake, and has tried to present himself as the RSF, him and RSF, as being on the side of the people against the Khartoum elite. So he, I think, weeping emotions, and he came out, and there's an agreement that was signed in December, and his side seems to be really eager to really honor that agreement, but the army has been very skeptical and did not show any commitment as far as honoring that agreement. So that is also has been a bone of contention, of course, that has spiraled to what we're seeing here today. While he has some support, others find this message hard to believe given the paramilitary forces' brutal track record. So people are wondering, all of a sudden now, you act like you're supporting the civilian side, and yet we know that even under President Omar al-Bashir, you could come very heavy-handed and using the Janjaweed in fighting anybody that was opposed to that leadership. And also just after the ousting of Omar al-Bashir, RSF under you was being used to brutally attack the civilian side, the protesters. So now all of a sudden you're championing for their rights. But I think for him coming and admitting in February that that was a mistake, of course he did not take ownership and responsibility over the attacks, the RSF and the killings that RSF meted against the protesters. But he's acting changed, and now he seems to be on the side of the protesters. And of course, a lot of people who are looking at this from a very diplomatic lens will see this is it's diplomacy at play here, and he might not really exactly mean what he's saying as far as him now turning around and displaying his love and support for a civilian leadership, because we know up until sometimes last year they were working together with Al Burhan. So what really led to them being divided. Okay, so that is a question that a lot of people are wondering about. Meanwhile, General Burhan, who is the head of the military and essentially the would I say the president, not exactly the president, but he is the leader of Sudan right now, General Burhan, has said the army will only fully hand over power to an elected government, further sidelining civilian representatives expected to be part of a power-sharing deal. But there are suspicions that both military men and their supporters are worried that what might happen to their wealth and influence if they're removed from their powerful positions, and that has been a key worry for the military outside of the ICC. I'll not talk about that because Dr. Matanga already talked about that earlier. But like I've said there, the military has been part and parcel of Sudan's leadership for a very long time, and the military hold key and run key industries in Somalia, not in Somalia, in Sudan, and they have a lot of economic interest in Sudan. So just to imagine that they have to give this away, I think leaves them very vulnerable, and that is something that I've said here time and time again. They might not really be ready to hand over power to the civilian who might really upset the status quo. And so we've seen countries come out, and there has been fears that the fighting could further fragment the country, worsen political turbulence, and draw in neighboring states. Diplomats who have played a crucial role in trying to urge a return to civilian rule are desperately trying to find a way to get the two generals to talk. A regional bloc agreed to send 3 presidents from Kenya's South Sudan and Djibouti in Khartoum, but it is unclear if they can make the trip, as no planes are flying in or out of the country. So that's why the presidents of Kenya, South Sudan and Djibouti have not landed yet in Sudan, because we know it's not safe for them to go there right now anyway. And the UK, US and EU have all called for a ceasefire and talks to resolve the crisis. Now, life in Sudan's capital Khartoum and in many other parts of the country has taken a really sudden turn, and very dramatic turn for the worse. At the heart of it, like I've said, are these two generals, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the leader of the Sudanese armed forces, that is the leader of the official Sudan's army, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, the better known as Hemedi, the head of the paramilitary rapid support forces. Now the two worked together and carried out a coup together. Now their battle for supremacy is really threatening to tear Sudan apart. The relationship between the two goes way back. Both played a key role in the counter-insurgency against Darfuri rebels in the civil war in Sudan's western region that began in 2003. General Burhan rose to control the Sudanese army in Darfur. Hemedi was the commander of one of the many Arab militias, collectively known as the Janjaweed. So Janjaweed was a collective or a collection of several Arab militias, which the government employed to brutally push down the largely non-Arab Darfuri rebel groups. Hemedi was simply a militia leader, playing a counter-insurgency role, helping the military, while General Burhan was a career soldier. Though, with all the ambitions of the Sudanese officer corps, anything was possible. Now, the military has been running Sudan for most of its post-independence history. I think I have already labored and I told you that. The government's tactics in Darfur, once described as a counterinsurgency on the cheap, used regular troops, ethnic militias and air power to fight off the rebels, with little to no regard of civilian casualties. So Darfur has been described as the first genocide of the 21st century, with the Janjaweed accused of ethnic cleansing and using mass rape as a weapon of war. Hemedi eventually became the commander of what could be described as an offshoot of the Janjaweed, his RSF. Hemedi's power grew massively once he began supplying troops to fight for Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. I've several times alluded to this. Sudan's then military ruler Omar al-Bashir came to rely on Hemedi and the RSF as a counterweight to the regular armed forces, in the hope that it will be too difficult for any single armed group to dispose him. So basically what we call that in the international relations is the balance of power. Okay? but this was like an arms race of some sorts. So he was trying to make sure that he had an extra. I don't know if whether he did not, Omar al-Bashir did not trust army to offer him the support and the protection that he needed as their president, and so he decided to make sure, as far as the army of the country was there, but he had also this group, the RSF, just in case he needed to use them, or he needed extra protection. And so that's why they sort of they became a very strong force and a parallel military for Sudan, I guess. And later that year, after Omar al-Bashir was ousted in 2019, later that year, they signed an agreement with the protesters to form a civilian-led government overseen by the Sovereign Council, a joint civilian military body with General Burhan as its head and Hemedi as his deputy. So the transitional government was supposed to have 11 people, 6 from the military, 6 from the civilian side and 5 from the military. And on the military side, General Burhan and Hemedi were there, and then other 3 military heads there. And so General Burhan is accused of starting to restore the Islamists and the former regime members of their old position. So what this means is that General Burhan is being accused of causing up to the people who are very close allies to former President Omar al-Bashir, who sometimes are considered to be Islamists. Remember, even as we speak right now, Sudan's constitution has been suspended, and also during the formation of this transitional government, that was really a bone of contention as they were trying to look for ways to make this new constitution. The civilian side really wanted a more liberal constitution, but the military side, who are seen as Islamist now in support of the former president, wanted a more Sharia-based constitution. So that was the bone of contention. So when you hear that General Burhan is being accused of bringing back the Islamists who perhaps had been ousted and who had been chased away from their positions after the removal of Omar al-Bashir, this is what I mean by that, okay? And so he was accused of trying to bring them back and to have these former regime members to their old positions, which I guess Hemedi was not very happy with that, because he felt maybe he was being threatened, or his ambitions were being threatened, or things like that. And of course, bringing these old guards also threatened the agreement that they had with the civilian side, okay? And of course, it was becoming very clear that the plan of General Burhan was to restore the old regime of Omar al-Bashir to power. So I think that also could have been a reason why there was a crack in that relationship. So Hemedi began to have doubts, as he felt Bashir's cronies had never fully trusted him. So that is where he was coming in, and he felt, if you're bringing these other old guards and repositioning them to their older positions, then that will be a problem for me. I'm just trying to paraphrase this idea of Hemedi having doubts over Bashir's cronies, and why he felt this will be a problem for him, even as he also jostled for a more powerful and a prominent position in Sudan's, let's say, politics, but security control there, because they're all army officials. Now, Sudanese politics has always been dominated by an elite largely drawn from the ethnic groups based and around Khartoum and the River Nile. And Hemedi comes from Darfur, and the Sudanese elite often talk about him and his soldiers in a very derogative terms. So some bit of ethnicity there, undertones playing. As a country, they normally refer to as country, bumpkins and fish to rule the state. So other side of the Sudanese has always been looking at the people from the Darfur region as very unfit to rule the place. So I think also Hemedi, I don't want to say that he was being driven by a need to prove himself and a need to prove that his people also can lead. And that's why he felt anybody that tries to challenge that position could be problematic for him. But, that is neither here nor there. So over the last 2 or 3 years, he has tried to position himself as a national figure, and even as a representative, this Hemedi, and even as a representative of the marginalized peripheries, in the international system, we do have the peripheries and we have the core. Like, for instance, Europe is the core, Africa is the periphery, do you understand? In those terms, so the marginalized. So he came out and he was trying to position himself as the voice for the marginalized. And I think it was very smart of him to now act as if he's trying to identify and supporting the civilian sides and trying to forge alliances with rebel groups in Darfur, South Kordofan, that he had previously been tasked with destroying. Can you imagine that? Now he has also spoken regularly of a need for democracy, and I think we saw this play out in February when he came out and said them ousting Abdallah Hamdok, the prime minister, was a mistake, and he was hoping that Sudan could work as quickly as possible to restore back a civilian rule, what him and RSF was pushing for, but something that the army part led by Al Burhan was not really keen on doing because of the reasons that we've been talking about and some that I've mentioned earlier there. Now, tensions between the army and the RSF grew as a deadline for forming a civilian government approached, focused on the thorny issue of how the RSF should be reintegrated into the regular armed forces. And then the fighting began, pitting the RSF against SAF, that is the Sudan Army, the official Sudan Army, SAF, at Hemedi against General Burhan for control of the Sudanese state. In one way, at least, Hemedi has followed in the footsteps of the SAF top brass, who he is now fighting. Because remember, they came together when they helped in ousting a former President Omar al-Bashir. And now he's following suit what they did to Omar al-Bashir at that time. Over the last few years, he has built a vast business empire, including the interest in gold mines and many other sectors. General Burhan and Hemedi have both faced calls from civilian leaders and victims of the conflict in Darfur and elsewhere to face trial for alleged abuse. Now also that is the issue of ICC at play, and I'll not get into the details of that because that has already been spoken about, and we've said that several times. The ICC there is also a very thorny issue that also is a key thing on why this conflict is even happening. Now the stakes are extremely high. We know that by now, and there are plenty of reasons for these former allies turned bitter enemies not to back down. There's so much at stake, but also of everything else that is going on in Sudan, there could also be a possibility of a proxy war, and I'll tell you by what I mean. Remember, in February, Sudan military, let me just read a news item from the AP news website. So I'll just quote what they wrote here. This news item is dated February 11th, 2023. And Sudan's ruling military concluded a review of an agreement with Russia to build a navy base on the Red Sea in the African country. Two Sudanese officials said on Saturday, they said the deal was awaiting the formation of a civilian government and a legislative body to be ratified. But while I read this, just have in mind that the second in command, that is Hemedi, has been having a very cozy relationship with Russia. So at this point, the agreement, the Sudan's ruling military had concluded a review of an agreement with Russia to build a navy base on the Red Sea in the African country. Two Sudanese officials have said. They said the deal was awaiting the formation of the civilian government, and that's why perhaps Hemedi was pushing for a civilian government and a legislative body to be ratified before it takes effect. The officials said Moscow met Sudan's most recent demands, including providing more weapons and equipment. So that was part of the agreement, that for Moscow to come and build this navy base, then they have to in return provide Sudan with more weapons and equipment. And I wonder, these weapons and equipment, which side were they going to be given, the RSF side or the official army side? The officials did not provide further details and spoke on a condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. A spokesperson for the Sudanese military declined to comment. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the deal still needs ratification by Sudan's yet to be formed legislative body. So you can see the urgency by which Hemedi really wanted this civilian rule to happen, the transition to happen very quickly, because he's been having a very good relationship, a very interesting relationship with Russia since some times back last year. And Sudan has been without a parliament since a popular uprising forced the military overthrow of long-time leader Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. The country has been mired in political chaos since an October 2021 military coup derailed its short-lived transition to democracy. So the agreement allows Russia to set up a naval base with up to 30 Russian troops and simultaneously keep up 4 Navy ships, including nuclear-powered ones, in the strategic port Sudan on the Red Sea. The base would ensure that Russian Navy's presence in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and spare its ship the need for long voyages to reach the area, according to Viktor Bondarev, the former Russian Air Force chief. Now, I'll tell you why I've even brought up this story and why I see, outside of every other factor and everything else that is happening in Sudan, and perhaps if there is an element of a proxy war. So, like I have read through this news item that the Sudan military finishes a review of Russian Red Sea. This was dated February 11th, 2023. So let's go back to another news item on this, which website is this, AA, dated 28th September 2022, last year. And the heading, the title is U.S. warns Sudan of consequences if it hosts Russian military base. So this was last year, okay? And when did the Sudan start reviewing that agreement with Russia? In February of this year. But this a warning by the U.S. was last year. So let's just read through a bit of this news item. Now, the U.S. ambassador to Sudan has warned of consequences if the Northeast African country allows the establishment of a Russian military base on the Red Sea coast. In an interview with the Taya newspaper, John Godfrey said there are some reports that Russia is trying to implement the agreement it signed with ousted President Omar al-Bashir in 2017. So this agreement that was being reviewed now in February of this year was actually signed by Omar al-Bashir in 2017 to establish a military base along the Red Sea. He warned that such a move, this is the U.S. official warning Sudan, he warned that such a move will isolate Sudan from the international community and undermine the country's interest. So this was a threat to Sudan. The U.S. was saying, if you even dare talk about this matter or even decide to consider allowing Russia to have this base, then you are going to have to suffer the consequences. And I'll quote what Godfrey said. Let me just remind us who Godfrey is. He is the U.S. ambassador to Sudan, okay? He's the U.S. ambassador to Sudan. And so he's quoted in this interview as saying that all countries have a sovereign right to decide which other countries to partner with, but these choices have consequences, of course, he said. He added that the U.S. can be a good partner, but that it will be possible by the creation of a new civilian-led government and a transitional framework that will take the country back to the path of democracy. So you can see what forces are really pushing for this democracy and all that. Now, during a visit to Moscow in November 2017 by President Bashir, who was overthrown in 2019 by a military coup, the two countries signed cooperation agreements on military training, experience sharing, and the entry of warships into the ports of the two countries. According to Russia Today, that is a newspaper outlet, or rather a media outlet in Russia, the Russian President Vladimir Putin on November 16, 2020, approved the establishment of a Russian naval base in Sudan capable of accommodating nuclear-powered vessels. All right. Now, Sudan Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Mohammed Osman al-Hussein said in a statement 3 days later that there is no full agreement with Russia on the establishment of a naval base in the Red Sea, but our military cooperation has been extended. That is in 2020. Now, November. Now, on December 9th, 2020, Russia media published a text of the agreements between Russia and Sudan on the establishment of a supply and a maintenance base for the Russian Navy along the Red Sea to support peace and security in the region. So obviously, this is also an issue that we cannot overlook. the interest that Russia has in Sudan and the counter interest that the US have in Sudan and the consequences that they already had warned Sudan, should they have gone ahead and agreed to implement this agreement, that they were going to face the consequences. So as much as these other issues are in place, and there are so many factors if you look at this whole story, but I think also we cannot rule out the issue of proxy war that is between the US and Russia, and we've seen how that is playing out in the international system, and now they also seem to be bringing that mess into Sudan, and we can see how that might act into, destabilizing not just Sudan, because this will be a problem for the rest of this region if this is not really brought to control as soon as possible. So that is just the information I needed to leave you with this afternoon so that you can ponder about. And of course, we shall be back here, God willing, tomorrow with this developing story and more details on what is happening in Sudan. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.